In 1994, a financial advisor named Bill Bengen sat down with a stack of stock market data going back to 1926, and he asked one simple question: how much money can you pull out of your retirement savings every single year without ever running out? His answer became the single most repeated number in all of personal finance: 4%. Withdraw 4% of your portfolio in year 1, adjust it for inflation every year after that, and your money should last 30 years, no matter what the market does. For 3 decades, that number has been treated less like a guideline and more like a law of physics. It's the backbone of the entire early retirement movement. It's baked into nearly every retirement calculator on the internet. Millions of Americans have built their entire life plan: when to stop working, how much house they can afford, when they can finally stop worrying, around this one number. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The man who invented the 4% rule doesn't fully believe in it anymore, not in the way it's used today. And the research organizations that test it every year keep landing on a very different, much scarier number. So today, we're asking the question a lot of people are quietly afraid to ask: is the 4% rule still safe? Or has the math that used to work for your parents quietly stopped working for you? To understand why this number might be breaking, you first need to understand why it worked in the first place. Because it wasn't a guess. It was built on real historical data, and it held up for a very specific reason. Bengen's original research looked at nearly 70 years of U.S. market history from 1926 onward. He ran simulation after simulation. What if you retired in 1929, right before the crash? What if you retired in 1937? In 1966, right before over a decade of stagnant markets? For every single one of those brutal starting points, he tested what would happen if a retiree withdrew a fixed percentage of their savings every year, adjusted for inflation, for a 30-year retirement. What he found was that even in the worst historical starting years, the absolute worst-case scenarios the market had ever produced, a withdrawal rate of 4% survived. Higher than that, and some of those worst-case retirees ran out of money before they died. At 4%, almost none of them did. A few years later, 3 professors at Trinity University ran their own version of the same test, using a wider range of stock and bond allocations. Their results echoed Bengen's almost exactly. With a portfolio split between stocks and bonds, a 4% withdrawal rate succeeded in roughly 95% of every 30-year period in the historical data. That study is the reason you'll sometimes hear this same idea called the Trinity study instead of the Bengen rule. They're really the same finding, discovered twice. And so an entire industry built itself around this number. Financial advisors used it. Bloggers turned it into the mathematical foundation of the FIRE movement. Financial independence. Retire early. Every retirement calculator you've ever plugged your numbers into, from Fidelity's to the free one your bank offers, is quietly running some version of this exact same math in the background. It became personal finance's version of a law of nature. Save 25 times your annual expenses, withdraw 4% a year, and you're free. Simple, clean, provable. The problem is, the world Bengen tested his rule against Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly, and it's the single biggest threat to the 4% rule. It's not really about your average return over 30 years. It's about the order those returns show up in. Picture 2 retirees. Same amount saved. $1 million each. Same average return over their 30-year retirement. Let's say 7% a year. On paper, they should end up in exactly the same place. But retiree A retires right before a strong bull market. Their portfolio grows in the early years, even while they're withdrawing money, because the market's climbing faster than they're pulling cash out. By the time a downturn eventually hits, years later, their portfolio is so much bigger that the hit barely matters. Retiree B retires right before a market crash. They're withdrawing the exact same fixed dollar amount, adjusted for inflation, but now they're pulling that money out of a portfolio that's shrinking, not growing. Every withdrawal sells off a bigger and bigger slice of a smaller and smaller pie. Even when the market eventually recovers, there are fewer shares left to recover with. Same average return, same starting balance, same withdrawal plan, and one retiree's money could run out a full decade earlier than the others, purely because of when the bad years happened to land. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's the actual mechanism hiding behind almost every real-world 4% rule failure. It's not that the market performed badly over 30 years. It's that it performed badly in the first 5. And this is exactly why the timing of your retirement, a factor completely outside your control, can matter more than almost anything else in the entire plan. Here's where this stops being an abstract, historical conversation and starts becoming personal. When Bengen built his original model, market valuations looked very different than they do today. One of the most widely used measures of how expensive the stock market is, the Shiller-Cape ratio, currently sits above 41. Its long-run historical average is closer to 17. The only other time in history valuations climbed anywhere near this high was right before the dot-com crash in 2000. That matters because historically, when you retire into an expensive market, one where prices are high relative to underlying company earnings, future returns from that starting point tend to be lower than average. And lower future returns, paired with the same fixed withdrawal rate, is exactly the setup that breaks a retirement plan. Then there's inflation. Bengen's original model was built in an era where inflation averaged a fairly gentle 2% to 3% a year. Recent years have looked nothing like that. Inflation spiked above 9% in 2022, a more than 40-year high, and even now, sitting closer to 3.8%, it's still meaningfully hotter than the environment the original rule was tested against. Here's why that specific detail matters so much. The 4% rule doesn't just have you withdraw the same amount every year. It has you increase your withdrawal every single year to keep pace with inflation. So if you retire right into a stretch of high inflation, you're not just fighting a shrinking portfolio. You're being forced to pull out more and more of it, faster than planned, at exactly the moment it can least afford to shrink. And then there's a third factor that has nothing to do with markets at all. We're simply living longer. Bengen's model assumed retirement savings needed to last 30 years. Today, with rising life expectancy, that same nest egg might need to stretch across 35 or even 40 years instead. Every extra year you're asking a fixed pile of money to support is another year the sequence of returns risk has room to do damage. Put all three of these together, historically high valuations, a recent history of severe inflation, and longer lifespans, and you get a very different starting point than the one the 4% rule was originally built to survive. Let's make sequence of returns risk less theoretical and put real numbers behind it, using two retirees who actually existed in history. Imagine the first retiree stopped working at the very end of 1999, right at the peak of the dot-com bubble, with $1 million portfolio split between stocks and bonds. Following the 4% rule, exactly as written, they withdraw $40,000 in year 1, adjusting upward for inflation every year after that. Within 3 years, they're living through the dot-com crash. Within 9 years, they're living through the 2008 financial crisis. 2 brutal bear markets, both landing inside the first decade of their retirement, precisely the window where sequence of returns risk does the most damage. Historical studies of this exact starting date show this retiree's portfolio getting stretched close to its limit, surviving, but only barely, with far less cushion than the model's average case scenario would suggest. Now imagine a second retiree with the exact same $1 million, the exact same 4% withdrawal plan, but starting almost precisely 10 years later at the beginning of 2010, right after the crash, right at the start of one of the longest bull markets in U.S. history. This retiree spends the next decade watching their portfolio grow even while withdrawing from it every year because the market is climbing faster than they're pulling money out. Same rule, same starting balance, same discipline, and 2 completely different lived experiences. separated entirely by 10 years of birth date and a bit of market timing, neither retiree had any control over. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the entire 4% conversation. The rule was tested against history's worst-case scenarios and survived them. But survived and comfortable are not the same words. Some of those historical retirees made it to year 30 with almost nothing left, following the same rule to the letter with a different. Let's make sequence of returns risk less theoretical and put real numbers behind it, using two retirees who actually existed in history. Imagine the first retiree stopped working at the very end of 1999, right at the peak of the dot-com bubble, with $1 million portfolio split between stocks and bonds. Following the 4% rule exactly as written, they withdraw $40,000 in year 1, adjusting upward for inflation every year after that. Within 3 years, they're living through the dot-com crash. Within 9 years, they're living through the 2008 financial crisis. 2 brutal bear markets, both landing inside the first decade of their retirement, precisely the window where sequence of returns risk does the most damage. Historical studies of this exact starting date show this retiree's portfolio getting stretched close to its limit, surviving but only barely, with far less cushion than the model's average case scenario would suggest. Now imagine a second retiree with the exact same $1 million, the exact same 4% withdrawal plan, but starting almost precisely 10 years later, at the beginning of 2010, right after the crash, right at the start of one of the longest bull markets in U.S. history. This retiree spends the next decade watching their portfolio grow, even while withdrawing from it every year, because the market is climbing faster than they're pulling money out. Same rule, same starting balance, same discipline, and 2 completely different lived experiences, separated entirely by 10 years of birth date and a bit of market timing neither retiree had any control over. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the entire 4% conversation. The rule was tested against history's worst-case scenarios and survived them. But survived and comfortable are not the same word. Some of those historical retirees made it to year 30 with almost nothing left, following the same rule, to the letter, with a different calendar. So does that mean the 4% rule is simply dead? The honest answer is more complicated than a yes or no, and it comes straight from the people who study this every single year. Morningstar, one of the most respected independent research firms in the industry, publishes an updated safe withdrawal rate study annually. Their December 2025 report, covering people retiring in 2026, landed on a considerably more conservative number, 3.9%, not 4%, for a typical retirement portfolio, based on forward-looking market forecasts and a 90% chance the money lasts 30 years. A few years earlier, in the aftermath of a particularly stretched market, that same research team recommended an even lower number, 3.3%. Here's the twist, though. Bill Bengen himself, the original creator of the 4% rule, hasn't been sitting still either. In his own recent research, he revisited his worst-case historical scenario using a more diversified portfolio than his original model used, and landed on a new, safe max figure of 4.7%. And for retirees today specifically, he's gone even further, suggesting that something in the range of 5.25% to 5.5% might be a reasonable, conservative starting point. So you have 2 of the most credible sources in the entire field, Morningstar and Bengen himself, publishing numbers on opposite sides of the original 4%. One says, be more careful than ever. The other, the man who started this whole conversation 30 years ago, says today's retirees might actually be able to afford to take out more. How can both of these be true at once? Because they're measuring different things. Morningstar's caution is driven heavily by today's high valuations and lower projected future returns. Bengen's more generous update comes from using a more diversified portfolio than his 1994 model, and from a recognition that most retirees don't actually spend with robotic, unwavering consistency for 30 straight years. They adjust. Which brings us to the piece almost every popularized version of the 4% rule leaves out entirely. The 4% rule, as most people use it, is a set-it-and-forget-it number. Withdraw the same amount, adjusted only for inflation, no matter what the market is doing, for 30 straight years. But that's not actually how thoughtful retirees, or the researchers studying them, think it should work in practice. Modern approaches to this problem talk about something called a guardrails strategy. Instead of locking in one fixed withdrawal percentage forever, you set upper and lower boundaries. If the market has a strong run and your portfolio grows well beyond plan, you allow yourself to spend a bit more. If the market drops sharply, especially in those critical early years, you pull back, trim discretionary spending, delay a big purchase, take a smaller inflation adjustment that year, specifically to protect the portfolio while it's most vulnerable to sequence of returns risk. There's an even more precise version of this floating around independent retirement research circles, sometimes called a CAPE-based withdrawal formula. Essentially, using how expensive or cheap the market currently is right at the moment you retire to calculate a smarter, more personalized starting withdrawal rate instead of blindly applying 4% regardless of conditions. The theme across almost all of this newer research is the same. The danger was never really the number 4%. The danger is treating any single fixed number as a permanent, unchangeable law in a market that never behaves the same way twice. A 70-year-old retiree with a pension covering their basic costs can often safely withdraw well more than 4% because they have a safety net the original model didn't account for. A 55-year-old retiring early with no pension and 40-plus years of retirement ahead of them may need to start meaningfully lower than 4%, precisely because they have more years for a bad sequence of returns to do damage. The number was never supposed to be one size fits all. It just got repeated so often by so many calculators and so many articles that an entire generation started treating it. So where does that leave someone watching this video, quietly doing the math on their own future? It doesn't mean panic. It doesn't mean the entire concept of retiring off your investments is broken. What it means is that the version of the 4% rule most people learned, pick one number, apply it blindly, never look at it again, was always an oversimplification of much more careful original research. The realistic takeaway looks something like this. Treat 4% as a reasonable starting conversation, not a guarantee. Understand that the first 5 to 10 years of your retirement matter disproportionately more than the years after that, which means having some flexibility built into your spending plan during exactly that window is worth more than almost any other single decision you can make. And revisit the number periodically, the same way the researchers who study it do every year, instead of setting it once in your 20s or 30s and assuming it'll hold forever. There are a few concrete things worth taking away from all of this, beyond just the headline number. First, if you're still years away from retirement, the exact percentage matters far less right now than simply saving aggressively and staying invested. Sequence of returns risk is a retirement day problem, not a working years problem. Second, if you're approaching retirement soon, pay close attention to market valuations at the moment you actually plan to stop working, not just an average historical number pulled from a calculator. A high starting valuation, like the one we're sitting at today, is exactly the environment where a bit of extra caution in year one can matter enormously down the line. And third, build flexibility directly into your plan before you need it. Knowing in advance that you're willing to trim spending in a rough early year is a very different position to be in than discovering that fact for the first time while your portfolio is already down 20%. None of this requires abandoning the 4% rule entirely. It requires treating it the way its own creator now treats it, as a starting estimate to be adjusted, not a number carved in stone. The 4% rule isn't dead, but the version of it that gets repeated in 5-second social media clips, simple, fixed, permanent, probably was already a little bit broken from the start. What's changed isn't the math, it's how much the world has started to notice. Bengen didn't build the 4% rule to be a promise. He built it to be a starting point, one data-backed answer to a question that every single person eventually has to ask for themselves. How much of this money can I actually spend without running out before I need to. 3 decades later, the honest answer is still the same as it always was. It depends on when you retire, on how the market behaves in your first few critical years, on how willing you are to adjust when conditions change. The number 4 just happened to be a good enough starting estimate to become a legend. If this video made you want to actually check your own numbers instead of guessing, that's genuinely the point. Fundamentary breaks down the financial ideas everyone repeats, but almost nobody fully explains. Subscribe if you want more of these. I'll see you in the next one.